Aliens prepared for 100 years to attack humans. They lasted 12 minutes. The first slide showed a planet. The second showed a crater where the planet used to be. By the time I reached slide 3, the ambassador from France had stopped taking notes entirely and was staring at the projection screen with the particular expression of someone processing information that is too large to process all at once. I kept clicking. My name is Dara Voss, Sergeant Major, Military Intelligence Liaison, 22 years in service and not a single year of it what I would describe as quiet. I had spent the last 6 years sending reports into a system that received them efficiently and responded to them not at all. I had spent the 6 years before that in the field, watching things that had no good explanation, and filing those observations with superiors who always had a reliable explanation for everything, even when they were wrong. Now I was standing before the United Nations Emergency Security Council, clicker in hand, 87 pages of classified material on the drive, 40 minutes to tell the assembled leadership of human civilization that we had a very specific and very large problem. The species on slide 3 was called the Vekarat. That was our translation. Their actual designation was not a word so much as a tone, a frequency their communication systems produced as an identifier, something your ear registers before your brain does. We had been using the name Vekarat in classified documents for 4 years. In a matter of days, depending on how things unfolded, the entire world would be using it. I gave them the history without decoration, 9,000 years of spacefaring capability, 31 civilizations discovered during that span, 17 civilizations no longer present in the galactic record. Nobody at the table moved. I clicked to the next slide. Average preparation time before each engagement, 6 to 11 years. The Vekarat were not quick. They were not gamblers. They were the most patient and methodical strategic force documented in the intelligence files, a species that approached the problem of another civilization, the way a very careful surgeon approaches a procedure, mapping every system, measuring every variable, running projections until the outcome was predictable enough to act on with confidence. The civilizations they had engaged ranged from single-planet species to multi-system powers with considerable military capability. Some had seen them coming and built responses. Some had not seen them coming at all. In both cases, the documented results were the same. The Vekarat did not win because they were faster or stronger. They won because they were more thoroughly prepared than any opponent they had ever faced could prepare against. I paused on that slide for 3 seconds, then I moved forward. For Earth, they had taken 100 years. I let that sit in the room without explanation for a moment, the way you let something heavy down slowly before releasing it. General Cal Draper, seated at the far end of the table with the expression of a man who had been briefed on catastrophic things professionally for 4 decades and had built a considerable tolerance for them, leaned forward. His voice was the voice of someone doing a fast calculation. 100 years is not their standard operating procedure. No, I said, it is not. What made us worth the deviation? Slide 11, I said, we will get there. I took them through the timeline from the beginning. The Vekarat had flagged Earth as a priority observation target in the early 1920s, not because of our technology. In the 1920s, our most advanced military hardware was things you loaded by hand and aimed with your eye. By any galactic standard, we were not a threat. We were barely a footnote. They flagged us because they could not categorize us. Not in the way that novelty resists categorization, in the way that a known formula keeps producing answers that break the model it is supposed to fit. The Vekarat had constructed behavioral models for every type of civilization they had previously encountered: expansionist species, isolationist species, warlike species that described themselves as peaceful, cooperative species that became warlike under specific conditions. They had a chart for all of it, with clear inputs and predictable outputs. We broke every chart they applied to us. Their observation teams had been filing increasingly uncertain reports for decades when the first formal alert was raised. We had fought 2 global wars of a scale that, by every prior model, should have left us fragmented beyond any meaningful recovery. We came out of those conflicts with more technology than we went in with international institutions that had not existed before the wars, and with a documented cultural memory of the cost that we then partially ignored and partially encoded into new systems of medicine, agriculture, and communication. The Xenosociology division spent years on it. They could not find a stable curve. Every time their analysts believed they had identified a consistent pattern in our behavior, we produced behavior that did not fit the pattern. The incident that triggered a 4-year internal review in their strategic planning committee was not a military event. It was footage from a natural disaster in the Indian Ocean in late 2004, a catastrophic wave. In the footage, recorded on an ordinary camera by an ordinary person on a beach, there were humans running toward the wave, not away from it, toward it, pulling strangers out of the water. People with no shared identification, no formal bond, no institutional obligation to each other, moving into danger on behalf of people they had never met. Their planning committee put this footage into review rotation and watched it for what their calendar system translates to roughly 4 years. They wrote in the committee record that they had no classification for this behavior. I clicked to the next slide. Dr. Owen Briggs, the xenolinguist to my left, had been in this room for the entire briefing and had the expression of a man who was carrying 3 separate difficult thoughts simultaneously and managing them poorly. He leaned toward me and asked quietly how I was holding up. "Fine," I told him. He absorbed this without comment. I looked at the screen. Slide 8 was a map of the solar system, 73 red markers on it. Each one a confirmed Vekarat observation post, active within the last decade, positioned at angles and ranges that provided comprehensive coverage of Earth and near-orbital space without triggering any detection system we had deployed. 73 windows they had been looking through for years. Ambassador Faye Morton, across the table, had maintained the composure of someone professionally trained to manage crises in public. Her voice, when she said the number, was the voice of the personal version of her making a very difficult adjustment. 73. Confirmed, I said. The working estimate for the actual total is higher. I did not mention the report I had filed 6 years earlier about the debris field near Titan, the one that had not behaved the way debris behaves, the one with the routing stamp from the office that was restructured out of existence 18 months after I submitted it. I did not mention it because the briefing was about what was happening now, and because there is a point at which carrying the record of being right when no one listened becomes less useful than carrying the information itself. My coffee mug was back at the installation, ceramic, chipped handle, sitting on my desk where I had left it when the summons came through, probably still warm if I got back within the next 20 minutes. I moved forward. The Vekarat had constructed the most precisely engineered invasion framework in documented galactic history, targeting data on every major communications node on Earth, accurate to specific hardware components, atmospheric entry vectors calculated to the nearest meter, kinetic deployment sequences run through 90,000 individual simulations, each accounting for known variants in our response systems. They had translated and analyzed every military manual, every emergency response protocol, every strategic doctrine that any government on Earth had ever published or operationally distributed. They had done careful, thorough, extraordinary work. If you were going to spend a century preparing to do something, this was how you would spend it. General Draper looked at me across the length of the table. The calculation behind his eyes had finished, and the result was visible in the set of his jaw. Your assessment, Sergeant Major. I set the clicker on the podium. They spent 100 years studying everything we do when someone gives us an order, I said. They spent considerably less time on what we do when no one does. The room sat with that for a moment. I picked the clicker back up. Slide 12 is countermeasures. I suggest we keep moving. I kept clicking. The alarm hit at 3:57. I had not been asleep. I had been at my desk in the intelligence wing, working through a translation inconsistency in a Vekarat communications intercept that Dr. Briggs had flagged 3 days earlier. The discrepancy was in a single phrase, one he had rendered 3 different ways in 3 attempts, and that none of his colleagues could agree on. I had been looking at the 3 versions for 40 minutes and had resolved nothing, but looking at difficult things with fresh eyes at odd hours was one of the skills the military had built into me early. My coffee mug was in front of me, ceramic chipped handle, almost finished. Then the alarm sounded. Not the general installation alert. The other one. The specific frequency that every person in that building had been trained to recognize in the first week of assignment, the one with no word attached to it and no ambiguity about what it meant. The one that said, with complete efficiency, that the preparation period was over. I was in the corridor before the second pulse. The installation was moving, not in chaos but in the particular organized urgency of a facility full of trained people who have received the signal they have been dreading and are responding to it with everything they have. Boots on metal grating, emergency lighting switching on along the lower corridors, the smell of electronics running hard and the sound of doors opening and closing in sequence as people moved to their stations. Captain Lynn Ward came up at my shoulder from the corridor to the left. 29 years old, professional calm so deeply embedded it had become structural, tablet already in her hand with the preliminary status reports loading. They came in early, she said. 3 days, I said. She showed me the tablet. The satellite network status display was a grid of green indicators turning red in a sequence that was too precise and too rapid to be equipment failure. This was deliberate. This was someone who had mapped our infrastructure and was dismantling it the way you would dismantle something you had spent a very long time studying. The Vekarat's first move, exactly as the intelligence files had predicted. I hit the stairs to the operations level. The sky through the high windows of the stairwell was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not fire and obvious shapes. Wrong in a subtler way, something in the upper atmosphere that registered before you could name it, a quality to the darkness suggesting it was occupied, that things were moving through the high air in ways that air was not supposed to contain. They were in the atmosphere. Commander Sue Holt was at the central console in the operations center. 11 years I had served alongside her. Her voice, in any condition I had ever observed, occupied a specific controlled register that did not change based on circumstance. She was using that register now. Satellite coverage is at 63% and falling, she said, eyes on the display. GPS is gone across all bands. Long-range communications are fragmenting. Hardlines are holding for now. Timeline on the hardlines. 12 minutes to cascade failure at the current degradation rate. She looked at me for half a second. But the hardlines are carrying more traffic than their models projected. That was the first place. Their plan developed a crack. The Vekarat had modeled our communications dependency accurately. Modern military coordination relies on networked infrastructure at a scale that would have seemed impossible a century ago. What they had not modeled with equal accuracy was how deeply we distrust our own best systems. Decades of field experience had built redundancy into redundancy into redundancy. Old radio bands, hardline trunk lines, encoded burst transmission protocols requiring no satellite support whatsoever. Systems that existed for no strategic reason other than the ingrained professional conviction. passed down through generations of military planners, that the sophisticated thing would eventually fail, and you needed the old thing underneath it. They had studied our doctrine carefully. They had not studied the degree to which we assume our doctrine will fail and build accordingly. The communications disruption was still severe. Every major military unit on Earth was isolated. No contact with command structures. No coordination across national boundaries. No received orders. The Vekarat's models predicted that this condition would produce a paralysis window of 20 to 40 minutes, during which the fleet would complete its primary objectives. That prediction was wrong in the most specifically important way. The first contact to come through the hardline relay network, 4 minutes after the initial strike, did not originate from a military command center. It was not from any emergency response authority. It was a signal relayed through 4 separate hardline stations, originating from a commercial airline pilot named Henrique Salgado, cruising altitude over the mid-Atlantic, 23 years of flight experience, and the kind of professional temperament that stays level when very strange things appear on instruments. Something had appeared on his instruments. Multiple contacts, moving in patterns consistent with no aircraft type in his charts, at velocities and angles that did not correspond to any aerodynamic principle he had spent 23 years applying. He had attempted to reach air traffic control. Air traffic control was not responding on any frequency he tried. He had assessed the information available to him, evaluated what he had available to work with, and made a decision. 11 minutes later, a relay report confirmed that Salgado's aircraft had made contact with a Vekarat forward scout vessel at altitude. The scout vessel was down. Salgado's aircraft had sustained structural damage and had landed on emergency designation at a military airfield in the Azores. Salgado and every person aboard had been accounted for. I read the report twice. The forward scout vessel had been equipped with the most advanced defensive sensor array in the Vekarat fleet. It had been designed to identify and respond to every known human weapons platform, calibrated against our complete documented military hardware inventory. It had automated response protocols for every engagement scenario the Vekarat had modeled against our capabilities. There was no model for a commercial passenger aircraft on a direct approach at cruising altitude. In 9,000 years of documented contact with spacefaring civilizations, the Vekarat had never encountered a scenario in which a civilian transport was used as a direct engagement asset. It was not a scenario that made rational strategic sense. They had not built a category for it. Lieutenant Ben Archer, stationed at the relay display to my right, pulled up the full network contact feed. The display showed fragmented engagement reports coming in through the surviving hardline network from every continent, every time zone, every theater simultaneously. It did not look like a coordinated military response. It looked like noise. Random, distributed, without the pattern that any doctrine would produce. "What is that?" he said. I looked at the display for a moment. It took me a second, and then I saw it. Not noise, not randomness. Something with structure that did not have a name in any military manual I had ever read. "That," I said, "is everyone making their own call." The Vekarat's strategy had been built on a specific model of how military organisms function. Command structure gives direction. Units execute the direction, remove the command structure, and the units stop having direction, and therefore stop functioning effectively. It was a clean and reasonable model. It had worked for them against every civilization they had previously engaged. What it had not accounted for was a military tradition that, at its cultural foundation, had always assumed command might not be available, and had built the expectation of independent judgment into every level of training. 2 million people in uniform across 30 countries had just lost all contact with their command structures. Not one of them had received a new order. Not one of them had been told what to do. Every single one of them was doing something. Because the thing about spending 2 decades training human beings to fight is that at a certain point the training stops being a set of rules they follow and starts being a way they think. You cannot remove the command structure and have people stop knowing what to do. You can only remove the coordination. The knowing stays. Outside, through the operations center windows, I could see 3 separate engagement signatures at different altitudes and directions. None of them matched organized military doctrine. All of them matched people who had looked at their individual situations and acted on the best information they had available. I thought about the mug on my desk somewhere above me in the building. Still warm, maybe. I would check after. I turned back to the display. The Vekarat fleet was precisely where their models predicted it would be. Their plan was executing exactly as designed. Every variable they had calculated was behaving as expected. The one variable that was not behaving as expected was everything on the ground below them. The next 12 minutes were going to require a significant amount of documentation. The first minute belonged to them. I want to be clear about that because the truth matters more than a clean story. The first 60 seconds of the engagement were theirs, completely and cleanly. Their second deployment wave came in on schedule, and it was extraordinary to observe. 100 years of targeting refinement expressed in real-time execution. Every insertion point precisely where the models had placed them. Every angle of approach exactly as calculated. For 60 seconds, it felt like the conclusion of something. Then the second minute happened. The Vekarat's models had a specific prediction for minute 2. Isolated human military units, cut off from command, would enter an assessed inaction period while attempting to restore communications and wait for direction. Their simulations had this period lasting between 20 and 40 minutes, during which the fleet would complete its primary engagement sequence. The observed behavior in minute 2 was the precise opposite of inaction. The units that were supposed to be waiting were not waiting. They were moving, without a shared plan, without coordinated orders, each one responding to what it could see and what it knew, which in the case of trained military personnel turns out to be quite a lot. The result looked like chaos from altitude. The Vekarat's observation systems were logging it as uncoordinated activity, which was technically accurate and strategically significant, because uncoordinated activity spread across an entire theater in every direction simultaneously is a very different problem than coordinated activity concentrated in predictable places. You can plan against an army. You cannot plan against weather. In minute 3, their tactical management system logged an anomaly. I read the translated error report months later, and the language in it was the language of engineers confronting something their system was not designed to handle. The AI had been constructed to model responses from organized military structures operating within command hierarchies. It was now being asked to model the simultaneous independent decisions of hundreds of thousands of individuals, each acting on different local information, with no shared operational logic connecting them. The system produced outputs that their engineers flagged as structurally inconsistent. Their lead strategist noted in the operational log that the adversary was responding like weather rather than like an army. Weather, as a strategic target, does not have a throat you can cut. Minute 4. A farming cooperative north of Winnipeg, Canada, with no military affiliation, no formal combat training, and access to a substantial inventory of agricultural and industrial equipment, observed a Vekarat atmospheric cruiser making low-altitude passes over their region. Their emergency communications were down. Their nearest military contact was not responding. They held a discussion among themselves. The discussion lasted 4 minutes and was recorded on a phone held by a man named Gary Cole, who said afterward that he had been recording because he thought someone should have documentation of what they decided. What they decided involved welding equipment. several vehicles with engine modifications, a considerable quantity of structural steel, and a working knowledge of angles that one of them had learned in a physics class many years earlier and had never expected to use in this specific context. The atmospheric cruiser came down in a field at 17 minutes past the hour. The after-action documentation on this incident runs to 42 pages. The executive summary is one sentence. It says, "They combined available equipment until the combined result exceeded the target's defensive threshold." The Vekarat had cataloged our military hardware with meticulous completeness. They had logged every weapons system, every delivery platform, every documented piece of combat equipment in every military inventory on Earth. They had not cataloged farming equipment. It had not been assessed as a relevant variable. Minute 5. The Vekarat command structure initiates its first mid-engagement reassessment. In 9,000 years of recorded engagements, no previous target had triggered a command reassessment within the first 5 minutes of active operations. Reassessments were post-engagement processes, review mechanisms, not real-time responses. The operational log shows a brief exchange between the fleet commander and the Strategic Advisory Board. The translated content: this engagement is not conforming to the model. The Advisory Board recommended maintaining the primary timeline. The fleet commander logged a notation that their own historians would later describe as the single most consequential sentence produced in the history of their civilization. The notation says, "The model may be the problem." Minute 6. I am on the roof of the installation with Commander Holt and Lieutenant Archer, and the sky is doing things I do not have adequate technical language for. There are light signatures at altitudes and angles that belong to nothing in any human aviation chart. There are 3 separate engagement sites visible from where I stand, different directions, different elevations, and none of them look like anything I was trained to recognize as organized military engagement. One of them appears to involve a train. I watch it for a moment. "What are we looking at?" Archer asks. "People deciding," I say. He looks at the sky. He is young enough that this is the first large thing he has been present for, and he is handling it the way young, capable people handle large things, by paying very careful attention. The Vekarat's tactical advantage had always rested on a specific kind of certainty. They knew what an opponent would do because they had documented what that opponent had done before. Their models ran on observed behavior. 100 years of careful watching had given them an extraordinarily detailed picture of how humanity organized and executed conflict. They had not spent equivalent time on how humanity behaves when the organizing structure disappears. The answer, it turns out, is it keeps going. Minute 7. I go back inside. The relay display in the operations center is dense with contact reports now, coming in from everywhere simultaneously, a map that looks like scattered light. I stand in front of it and do not try to read it as doctrine. I read it as data. Each point of contact on that display is a decision. Someone who looked at their situation, assessed what they had, and acted on what they concluded. Multiplied across hundreds of thousands of people, then millions, across every geography the Vekarat fleet was distributed across. Not an army following a plan. Something older than an army. Minute 8. The Vekarat's targeting accuracy degrades measurably, according to the data recovered from their operational logs later. Their engagement protocols are running against behavioral templates that no longer match what they are observing. The processing lag is not catastrophic on its own, but it is compounding. Each second of delay produces a slightly larger gap between their models and the actual situation, and that gap is growing in a direction their systems cannot self-correct, because the self-correction mechanism assumes the models are basically sound. The models are not basically sound. Minute 9, the fleet holds. The entire fleet, in its full deployment configuration, stops active engagement operations for a period their logs record as 93 seconds. This is not a pause in the cinematic sense. This is a command decision to stop and review, which in the context of an active engagement does not have a clean recovery path. On the ground, in the 93 seconds that the fleet holds position, nothing on the ground stops. There are no orders coming down. There are no communications being received by any unit from any command structure. Nobody has told the people on the ground to keep going. They keep going. I am back on the roof during the 93 seconds. It is the quietest the sky has been since 3:57. There is a car alarm going off in the town to the east, triggered by vibration at some earlier point, cycling through its signal without urgency. The air is cold and carries a faint electrical edge. The darkness above the installation is thinning slightly at the far edges, the way it does before a light source approaches. I stand on the roof and I wait. Minute 10, the fleet moves, not forward, lateral. Their command structure is attempting to consolidate engagement zones, to focus resources on sectors where the response density is lower. There are no sectors where the response density is lower. The response is everywhere because the people generating it are everywhere, and they are where they are, doing what they can determine to do with what they have, without waiting for anyone to tell them which sector to be in or when to start. Minute 11. The fleet commander sends a priority transmission to the Strategic Oversight Board on the Vekarat homeworld. I have read the translation of this transmission more times than I can count. It is brief. It says, approximately, "We have encountered a condition our preparation did not model for. The limiting factor is not their weapons capability or their coordination. The limiting factor is that they do not stop when the conditions that should produce stopping are present." Minute 12. The last Vekarat vessel clears the exosphere. Their exit is organized and precise. Even in withdrawal, they move as a unit in formation with the discipline of a force that has operated together for a very long time. They do not scatter. They do not fragment. They leave in order. I watch the last trace of their atmospheric signature disappear on the monitoring equipment. I go inside. I walk back to the intelligence wing and sit down at my desk. The coffee mug is still there. Ceramic chipped handle, the coffee is cold. I drink it anyway. 12 minutes. 100 years of preparation. 12 minutes of us. The scout vessel that came down in the parking lot of the installation was, in retrospect, the luckiest piece of circumstance in the history of our species. It came down intact because of the angle of its final descent and a patch of very soft ground that absorbed the impact in exactly the wrong way for the Vekarat and exactly the right way for us. The hull was stressed but sealed. The power systems were offline. The internal data architecture was entirely intact. It was still transmitting when our technical team reached it 30 minutes after the last vessel cleared the exosphere, not transmitting to anywhere as it turned out. The fleet was gone, and the relay signal was cycling with nothing to receive it, like a radio broadcasting into an empty room. But the transmission logs were intact, and the storage architecture was intact. And within 72 hours, Dr. Briggs had established a partial access pathway into the largest single repository of information about our species ever assembled by an outside source. I was in the translation room for most of the next 6 weeks. The archive was not what any of us expected it to be. We expected tactical data, weapons assessments, military capability analysis, strategic vulnerability mapping, the kind of material you would expect from a 100-year preparation for a military engagement. All of that was present. It was thorough, accurate, and in some cases more current than our own internal records. But it was a small fraction of the archive. The majority of it was about everything else. The Vekarat had spent 100 years not primarily studying how we fight. They had spent 100 years studying how we live. Our music was in there. Not recordings, but analyses, structural breakdowns, pattern mapping across thousands of musical traditions. 100 years of a species trying to understand why we kept making organized sound for no survivability purpose, and why the organized sound we made had so many different structures that shared underlying mathematical relationships. We had apparently arrived at independently across cultures with no contact with each other. Their analysts had written a 40-page document on this. The conclusion was that we appeared to be communicating with ourselves in a language that did not map to any information exchange model they had encountered. They classified the music archive as emotionally functional but strategically irrelevant. They kept it anyway. Our literature was there, our visual art, our recorded performances, our religious texts, all of them annotated with the consistency of people who had spent serious time with difficult material and could not arrive at a synthesis. Their cultural analysis team had filed a report noting that we held, simultaneously and without apparent discomfort, contradictory frameworks for understanding existence, and that these contradictory frameworks appeared to coexist within the same individuals without producing the cognitive breakdown their models predicted such contradiction should cause. They had a word for this in their language that Dr. Briggs translated, after considerable debate, as functional contradiction. It was filed as an anomaly, not a pathology. We kept finding things like that throughout the archive, observations that were accurate and categorizations that were wrong. The Vekarat were extraordinary observers. They could see what we did. They could record it with precision. What they could not do, in 100 years of trying, was fit what they observed into a framework that fully made sense. Dr. Owen Briggs sat next to me in the translation room through most of those 6 weeks. He was one of those people who processes difficult information by getting very quiet, which meant the room was frequently silent for long stretches while both of us read. He looked up one afternoon and said, "They were afraid of us." I kept reading. "Not in the threat assessment sense," he said. "Something more specific, the way you are afraid of something you cannot predict." I thought about that. They took 100 years because they needed 100 years to convince themselves they had us understood, I said, and they never quite managed it. Briggs went quiet again. Then they came anyway. They did. Whatever they had not resolved in their internal debates and reassessments and 4-year review periods, they had come anyway. Because the alternative, presumably, was leaving something unpredictable in the vicinity of a growing technology base. And that was apparently a worse option than an engagement that was not fully modeled. There were several documents in the archive dealing with this specific internal debate. Years of strategic council discussions about whether to engage at all. Arguments from their xenosociology division that Earth required more observation time. Arguments from their military planning division that continued observation, while our technology advanced, was the greater risk. Arguments from both sides going back and forth across decades. The vote to engage had passed by a narrow margin. The xenosociology division had filed a dissenting report. I read it 3 times. The dissent said, in its central argument, this species does not follow stable behavior curves because it is not a stable behavioral system. It is a dynamic system, meaning it does not settle into a predictable pattern because pattern settling is not how it functions. What we have observed across 100 years is not variance around a mean. It is continuous, deliberate, recursive change. Engaging a dynamic system with static models will produce unpredicted outcomes. The dissent had been overruled. The rest of the archive confirmed everything the dissent had warned about. There was a full document cataloging the things the Vekarat had gotten wrong in their engagement models, compiled by their own analysts in the 72 hours after the withdrawal. I found it near the end of the archive, and read it in one sitting in the early hours of the morning with a cup of cold coffee, and an increasingly complicated relationship with my own feelings about what I was reading. They had believed communications blackout would produce paralysis. What it had produced was autonomous action at every level simultaneously, which was a significantly harder problem. They had believed civilian populations would represent a liability, a pressure point that would drive governments toward early negotiation. They had not modeled for a species that had spent the previous century specifically developing civilian resilience systems and civilian capacity to function in the absence of normal institutional support. They had identified our history of internal conflict as an indicator of fragility. They had not understood that a species which has spent 10,000 years fighting with itself has 10,000 years of accumulated experience in continuing to function while damaged. They had modeled our willingness to act on behalf of strangers as an outlier behavior, a statistically rare response pattern present in some individuals under specific conditions. They had not understood that it was not an outlier. It was the baseline. The last item in the document was the one that made Briggs go very still when I showed it to him the next morning. It was filed under the heading, Modeling Failure Root Cause Assessment. It said, "We did not account for the possibility that the adversary had already accepted the worst outcome and was operating without the constraint of avoiding it." Briggs read it twice. "They thought we were motivated by survival," he said. "Yes," I said. "And we are," he said. "Partially," I said. He sat with that. The thing about the Vekarat's model was that it was built on a reasonable assumption. Every species they had encountered was, at its behavioral foundation, organized around avoiding the worst possible outcome for itself. This was true of every civilization they had engaged. It was a reliable enough axiom that it had functioned as the foundation of all their strategic modeling. What the data from Earth kept producing, and what their analysts kept flagging as anomalous without ever fully resolving it into a category, was behavior that did not fit an organism primarily motivated by self-preservation. Behavior that looked, in their models, like an error in the data. It was not an error in the data. It was just us. The birthday photograph was in a subfolder of the Cultural Observation Archive, near the end of a section on social bonding documentation. It was a photograph of a family, human, somewhere with a beach in the background, and a table with food on it. People of several ages gathered around what appeared to be a celebration of some kind. Someone in the picture was laughing. The image had the quality of photographs taken for personal keeping rather than for any public record. The Vekarat had it filed under a header that Dr. Briggs translated as Anomalous Behavioral Documentation, Non-Strategic Subcategory, Social Cohesion Display. It had a note attached. The note said in translation, Preserve, Category Undetermined. I looked at that photograph for a long time. We ran every identification process we had available. We found nothing. The image appeared to date from several decades back, which meant the people in it were very likely no longer alive. Someone's family, at a birthday or a gathering or an ordinary Saturday that had seemed worth recording, had ended up in an alien archive marked too important to discard but too confusing to classify. I put the photograph in my pocket. Briggs noticed. He did not ask about it. He went back to his translation work. The 6 weeks in the translation room gave me a more complete picture of the Vekarat than I had expected to have. They were not simple. They were not beyond understanding. They were a species that had made a very considered decision based on very thorough information, and had been wrong about it in ways that their own best analytical minds had partially predicted. Their internal descent had been documented, preserved, and overruled. What had come after the overruling was not, in their archive, recorded as a failure. It was recorded as a contingency, a scenario outside the primary model that had activated and that required reanalysis before any future engagement. The reanalysis, as far as I could tell from the archive, was ongoing. I found myself standing beside the scout vessel in the parking lot on the last day of the translation work, looking at its hull in the late afternoon light. The optical sensors were offline. The transmission array was dark. It was an object now rather than a system, something that had once been full of purpose and was now just metal resting on asphalt. I thought about the birthday photograph in my pocket. The vessel had been transmitting for 2 weeks before the relay loop timed out, sending everything it observed. The parking lot, the sky above it, the installation in the distance, the people moving through their days in the background of its quiet, cycling signal. It had been watching us the way the Vekarat had been watching us for 100 years. I stood next to it for a while and thought about what it had seen. 6 months later, I was standing at a podium in a building that should not logically exist, in front of an audience that should not logically be sitting in the same room together, about to deliver a briefing that no one in the history of diplomatic activity had ever had reason to prepare. The room was a converted conference space in a neutral facility in Switzerland. The ceiling was slightly too low, and the ventilation system was marginally too loud, and someone had made the decision to set up a refreshments table near the side wall, which included, among other items, several urns of coffee. Half the faces in the room were human. Half were not. Everyone was being very polite. There was a quality to the politeness that you find in rooms where people have substantial reasons not to be polite and have decided, collectively, and for now, to be polite anyway. I had been in rooms like that before. The stakes usually made them easier rather than harder, because everyone understood what the alternative looked like and found this preferable. I had the ceramic mug with the chipped handle on the podium in front of me. I had carried it from my desk at the installation in my bag that morning. I could not have explained this choice if asked. I did not offer to explain it. The session had been organized by an 8-person committee that had spent 3 months determining, among other things, what temperature to set the room to. This was not a trivial problem. The Vekarat delegation had environmental requirements that did not fully overlap with human comfort ranges, and the compromised temperature was one at which everyone in the room was slightly cool, but nobody was incapacitated, which was a reasonable outcome for a first meeting, and probably a reasonable metaphor for what we were attempting more broadly. Their delegation included 7 members. I had read their dossiers. The one who sat at the center of their arrangement was their nearest equivalent to a diplomatic official, a role that Dr. Briggs had spent weeks finding an accurate translation for, and had eventually rendered simply as the one who speaks for the group in situations where speaking is the appropriate response. I had looked at the files on all of them for a combined total of probably 40 hours over the past 6 months. They were not what I expected, which was itself expected, because the archive had taught me that the Vekarat rarely were. I was introduced by Colonel Pete Harmon, who kept the introduction brief in the way of someone who understands that the less scaffolding you put around a thing, the better it stands on its own. He said my name, my role, and the purpose of the address, and then he sat down. I looked at the room. I looked at the Vekarat delegation. I started talking. The address I delivered was not the one I had drafted in the immediate aftermath of the engagement, or the revised version I had written 3 months later, or either of the 2 versions I had revised further in the weeks before this session. All of those versions had been built around an assumption about what this specific room needed to hear. Standing in front of this specific room, I decided to say what was actually true instead. 12 minutes, I said. That is the number you came here to understand. I am going to tell you what I think it means, and it is going to be less flattering to us than what you may have expected. The translator was a system I did not fully understand, developed jointly in the 6 months since the engagement, that processed and rendered in both directions with a lag of approximately 2 seconds. When I paused, I could see the Vekarat delegates receiving the translation, absorbing the words with the particular quality of attention that a species gives to information it has been waiting a long time to receive. The 12 minutes were not a demonstration of our strength, I said. They were a demonstration of what we are. Those are not the same thing, and I think it is important to be accurate about which one you encountered. I had their attention, all of it human and otherwise. You spent 100 years studying us and you were extraordinarily thorough. Your data was accurate. Your observations were precise. Your cataloging of our behavior was more complete than most of our own institutional records. You understood what we do. What you had difficulty with was why we do it. And the why is the part that matters for the conversation we are attempting to have in this room today. I pulled the photograph from my pocket. I set it where the projection system could capture it and display it on the screen behind me. A family at a beach, a table with food, someone laughing at something just outside the frame. A photograph from someone's private life, kept for decades in an alien archive under the category, too important to discard, too confusing to classify. This was in your archive, I said. You kept it for nearly a century and you never resolved what it meant. I would like to tell you what it is. I looked at the photograph on the screen. It is an ordinary day that someone decided to record because the people in it were worth recording. That is all. There is no strategic content. There is no military significance. The people in it are very likely no longer alive. Someone in your observation program 100 years ago saw this photograph and could not set it aside. I looked at the room. That is the part of us that your models could not categorize, not our weapons or our tactics or our response capacity. This. I let that sit. You observed us for a century, and your analysts kept producing reports that flagged us as anomalous. The behaviors that broke your models were not extraordinary behaviors. They were ordinary ones. People recording ordinary days. People moving toward danger on behalf of strangers. People in a farming cooperative solving a problem with the tools available to them. These are not the exceptional behaviors of our civilization. These are the normal ones. There was a quality to the silence in the room that I recognized from moments in the intelligence wing, when something in the data suddenly became clear. The silence of something being understood after a long resistance. Your dissent document got it right, I said. The members of your xenosociology division who argued that engaging a dynamic system with static models would produce unpredicted outcomes were correct. The corrective action is not a better model. The corrective action is an acknowledgement that we are not the kind of thing that can be fully modeled in advance. I looked at the lead Vekarat delegate. Neither, I suspect, are you. The translation took 2 seconds. Then something shifted in the arrangement of the delegate's posture that Dr. Briggs would later tell me, based on his months of intensive study of their physical communication system, indicated something in the range of what we would describe as acknowledgement. Not agreement, necessarily. Acknowledgement. I picked up my coffee mug. I looked at it for a second. I set it back down. I want to address the question that the 12 minutes does not answer, I said, because I think it is the question that actually matters for what we are attempting to do in this room. I looked at both halves of the audience. The 12 minutes demonstrated that we are very difficult to remove. It did not demonstrate that we are safe to be near. Those are not the same thing, and I would rather say this plainly than have it sit unspoken in every conversation we have for the next 50 years. Nobody moved. Our archive review made clear that your analysts struggled for a century to distinguish between our constructive impulses and our destructive ones, because they often look the same from the outside and sometimes they are the same event. We build. We conflict over what we build. We build better things because of the conflict. From a distance, this is not easily distinguishable from a species in the process of dismantling itself. Sometimes it is. We are aware of this. It is not a secret we are keeping. I paused. What I can tell you, based on everything in your archive and everything in ours, is that the only version of the next 100 years that works for either of us is one where we find out what the other one is actually like, rather than what our models say. Your models of us were built from observation without contact. They were the most thorough external study of any species in the galactic record. They were still insufficient. I paused again. Our knowledge of you is 6 months old. We have the archive and we have this room. That is almost nothing. We have no clear picture of who you actually are. I think we should develop one. I think that is a better use of the next century than both of us preparing for what we assume the other one will do. The lead delegate's posture shifted again in the specific way that Briggs had identified as meaningful. The translator produced an approximation, and Briggs, seated in the front row, gave me a small nod meaning. Accurate translation, not just functional. What the delegate said was, we kept the photograph because it meant something we did not have a category for. We are willing to discuss what category that might be. I picked up the photograph from the podium. I held it for a moment. A birthday, I said. That is what we call this kind of gathering. We hold them every year on the anniversary of someone's arrival in the world. We invite the people who matter to that person. We make food and we talk and we mark that another year has passed. 2 seconds of translation. The delegate asked, "What are you trying to mark?" I looked at the photograph. That the day happened, I said, that the people in it were there, that it was worth nodding. There was a long pause in the room, not an uncomfortable one, the kind that happens when something arrives that needs to be absorbed before anyone speaks again. I looked at General Draper in the human section. He was looking at the projection of the photograph on the screen with the expression of a man who has, in his career, been present for a great many significant moments and is cataloging this one carefully. Ambassador Faye Morton was looking at her hands on the table in front of her. Lieutenant Archer was looking at the Vekarat delegation with the specific focused attention of someone who is reorganizing their understanding of something in real time and finding the new arrangement better than the one before it. I set the photograph back on the podium. The 12 minutes are not the beginning of what you should know about us, I said. They are not the most important thing. They are one data point, and like all data points, they mean considerably less on their own than they mean in context. I looked at both halves of the room. We would like to provide the context, if you are willing to provide yours. There was a further exchange between the delegations, formal statements on both sides that had been prepared in advance and were delivered now. The agreement that resulted from the session was not large. It was a first step that knew itself to be a first step, careful about how much weight it was carrying and deliberate about where it was placed. It established a framework for further contact. It established a process for archive exchange in both directions. It established a joint working group to address the temperature problem, which remained unresolved and was going to require more than one meeting. It was, in the accounting of history, a small document. In the accounting of what might have happened instead, it was extraordinary. The session broke for refreshments and informal exchange, the latter being understood by everyone present to be the reason the former existed. Careful conversations in awkward conditions. People finding that the specific and ordinary texture of another group was both less strange than expected and more strange in ways that were interesting rather than alarming. Dr. Briggs was deep in conversation with one of the Vekarat delegation members near the window, his notebook out, his expression the expression he wears when 3 things are connecting at once, and he does not want to lose any of them. Colonel Harmon was standing near the door in the posture of a man who has successfully completed a difficult task and is allowing himself approximately 90 seconds of quiet satisfaction before moving on to the next one. I was standing near the refreshments table with my ceramic mug when the lead Vekarat delegate approached. Their translator unit was active. They looked at the mug in my hand, then at the urns on the table, and they asked a question through the translator in a tone that Briggs would later describe, when I told him about it, as genuinely curious rather than formally diplomatic. "What is that?" I told them. The plant, the process, the result. The temperature range at which most people who used it preferred to have it. The fact that most regular users had it multiple times daily. The social infrastructure that had developed around the specific practice of drinking it in shared spaces with other people, the particular kind of conversation it produced. The way that many significant decisions in human history had been made in rooms that also contained it. They considered this. Then they asked, "Is it ceremonial?" I looked at the urn. I thought about the mug on my desk at 3:57, the one I had left when the alarm sounded, the one I had thought about in the corridor and on the stairs, and on the roof of the installation while the sky above me contained a fleet that had spent 100 years preparing to end us. The one I had come back to when the 12 minutes were over and drunk from cold anyway, because it was there, and it was mine, and the morning had been the morning it had been. I thought about the family in the photograph at their table with their food, the person laughing at something outside the frame, the ordinary day that someone had decided was worth keeping in a photograph for as long as photographs last. I thought about 100 years of watching from a distance and not quite understanding what you were looking at. "Yes," I said, "basically." The delegate looked at the urns on the table. They looked at the mug in my hand. The 2 seconds of processing went by. Then they asked, in the voice of someone who has been building toward a small question for longer than it might appear, "May I try it?" I looked at the empty cup that our protocol team had placed on the table beside the delegate's position, because our protocol team had thought through this possibility and prepared for it, because we are, among other things, a species that anticipates the small moments where things could go well and puts a clean cup nearby just in case. I poured. I handed it across. 100 years, 12 minutes, 6 months of an archive and a borrowed photograph and a room in Switzerland with the ventilation running slightly too loud. And now this. A cup of coffee crossing the distance between two civilizations that had tried, each in their own way, to understand something about the other without knowing how to ask. I did not say anything. They did not say anything. We stood at the refreshments table in a room that should not logically exist, and we let the moment be exactly what it was, which was small and ordinary and worth recording. Copy that.